Greetings and welcome everybody. Thank you all for coming out. I'm Matt Courtney, a recent graduate of the Mind, Brain, and Education program here at Harvard Graduate School of Education. I want to remind everyone that there is going to be a Q&A towards the end of the program, and it is now my pleasure to introduce our host for this afternoon, Dr. Howard Gardner.
Thanks, Matt. Am I audible? Okay. Well, I'm very pleased to be part of this Mind, Brain, and Education sponsored event. And it's great that Noam Chomsky, who is a neighbor of ours, lives on Memorial Drive, and a friend of me and my family, and one of the world's great scholars, intellectuals, thinkers, really part of the history of our era, has agreed to come over here and to spend a bit more than an hour. He and I are going to talk for a while, and then, as Matt says, we'll open up for questions. As some of you know, I've been here for a long time, 55 years, living in Cambridge, but I realized that, Noam, you've been here longer.
You're a mere child.
And Noam Chomsky actually had the same teacher that I did, a man named Nelson Gutman, who was the founder of Project Zero, where I've continued to work for almost 50 years. And I believe it was Nelson who recommended you for the Society of Fellows, which was a very important intellectual center, still is, in the Harvard campus. And another tie that we had, though I think before we knew each other, is you spent time at the Center for Cognitive Studies with Jerome Bruner, many of you know, who recently died. And I would say that neither I nor Noam agreed with everything that Nelson said, or agreed with everything that Jerry said, but we learned from their stimulation in their company, and it's part of what makes living in Cambridge, whether you're at Harvard or MIT or somewhere else in the vicinity, a very, very special experience. This afternoon, getting ready for my class next week, who's here from my class? Great. I was reading The Theory of Justice by John Rawls, and I did not remember that you are cited in there. You know that?
Oh, yeah. We've talked about it quite a lot.
Yes, that Noam Chomsky's ideas in aspects of a theory of syntax, which was published a few years before A Theory of Justice, was one of the things that got Rawls to put forth a certain argument about intuitions in the moral sphere. Noam has also been a friend of the school. His wife Carol taught here for many years, taught children's language, was a colleague of those of us who were in Larson Hall, and he's been good enough to come here at various times to converse with students. I've seen him in what used to be Conroy Commons. We now have the Gutman Cafe. And most recently, we had a conversation, a quite interesting one, a year or two ago, about the work of Paulo Freire, who clearly had some influence on your thinking about education. So my rough plan for today, and I think Noam has agreed with this, is that we're going to start with about 15 minutes talking about language, and then segue into some time on cognition and on the mind, and then some time on education. And several of you were good enough to submit questions, and I've looked at them, and some of them will crop up in the conversation, but I decided that it was better to have a conversation than for me to be the question man. But when we finish our conversation, we'll open up the mics and if your question wasn't touched on, you can bring it up, and if it wasn't submitted, you can bring it up too. And I asked Noam whether there were any topics that were off limits, and he said no. So the floor is open. So when you came up here to work in the Society of Fellows, to be a fellow for 3 or 4 years probably, were you already working on issues of language?
Oh yeah, I was doing the earliest work on what later was called generative grammar, and a lot of that was based on some ideas of Nelson's about constructional systems, partly based on new work that had come out on, was just becoming known on recursive function theory, and of course some ideas from Zelig Harris's version of structural linguistics. And that was the main thing I was working on.
So I followed that, but I think some of the students will probably need a little more texture. So if you could put it in a bit more lay language.
Lay language. Well, what's now called generative grammar, which kind of began right at that time, late 40s, is an effort to capture something that was not known at the time. Unfortunately, it was only discovered decades later, but it was kind of a challenge for the study of language that was issued right at the beginning of the modern scientific revolution by Galileo, by the scientists, philosophers at the Port Royal Monastery and others. They pointed out that humans have to them, virtually miraculous ability to use just a few symbols to convey to others an infinite number of thoughts, as they put it, what passes within their soul to convey to others who have no access to their souls. And they can somehow do this by just using a small number of symbols. Galileo regarded this as the greatest invention in human history, comparable to Michelangelo, the greatest artist and scientist. And it was a challenge which was not taken up because nobody could see exactly what it meant. But generative grammar, not knowing anything about this, began to take it up. It really wasn't until the mid-20th century that the intellectual tools were available to try to capture these ideas, to see how this could be done. That's basically what now you all know as the theory of computability, the work of great mathematicians in the 1930s and 40s, Kurt Gödel, Alan Turing, others, established the theory of computability on very firm ground. You could then understand clearly what it meant for a finite device like your brain or your laptop to have the capacity to generate an infinite number, an unbounded number of objects, in this case linguistic expressions, each of which, if properly interpreted, constitutes a potential thought. So at least you could begin to address the challenge that was issued 500 years ago and then pretty much forgotten. And again, unfortunately, all of this was totally unknown, only discovered decades later. But and I was lucky to have been born just at the right time, at the time when these ideas were becoming available in logic and mathematics. So if you were an undergraduate, you could learn about these things, which I did. And it was immediately clear how you could try to capture the principles in our mind, obviously a finite object, which has its capacity to use a small number of elements to convey to others thoughts that maybe they never thought of themselves but can understand. If you look back over history, it's still not as well known as it should be. And incidentally, this is one of the things that Nelson didn't like at all, I should say. But
which was what? Well, let me just check. Is Professor Chomsky audible back there? Paul, can you hear him?
Yeah. If you go back to the 17th century and take a look, say, at Descartes' Discourse on Method, and look closely at the argument that he gives for his famous body-mind dichotomy. Why does he argue that there's a mind distinct from the body? Well, if you look over the argument, which is, interestingly, has not really been recognized much in scholarship and history of philosophy, but just take a look at it. He believed, like every scientist at the time, including Newton, that the world was a mechanical object. It was a machine, like something like that an artisan could make out of gears and levers and things that push each other around and so on. And he tried to show, to carry out the basically Galilean effort to try to demonstrate that everything in nature could be accounted for in mechanical terms. That was the goal of the early modern scientific revolution. And he thought he had shown that, but he recognized that there were certain things that didn't fall within mechanical explanation. And crucially, it was the use of language. He recognized that our ordinary use of language is what could be called creative. We are constantly producing new expressions which have never been produced before, which we've never heard, which others have never heard, and which are appropriate to situations, but are not caused by the situations. Quite crucial distinction. The way the Cartesians put it, we are incited and inclined to speak in particular ways, but not compelled. So like we could, say, start talking about today's Red Sox game, if there is one, or something like that. But it wouldn't be appropriate to the situation, so we're not doing it. But it's certainly within our capacity to do it, or to say it's perfect gibberish.
Was he talking, or were they thinking about, let's just say, syntax versus semantics?
No.
They weren't.
It's just what you could, this is all before any of these concepts could be sharpened precisely. It's just we have some means to do this. In fact, it was considered, well, in fact, this is, what are these means? Well, for Descartes, that's our mind. Our mind is an object, an entity which is based on a different principle than the mechanical principle on which the rest of nature is based. And its fundamental element is a kind of creative capacity. There are precursors to this, interesting ones, but in Descartes it becomes critical. So that's the crucial distinction between mind and body. And notice that this is a perfectly reasonable scientific hypothesis. People ridicule it these days, but it's not. Very sensible scientific hypothesis. There's something that's not accounted for by a mechanical conception of the universe, because no machine could do this. So therefore you have to have some other principle in nature. That's Rex Cogniton, a thinking entity. The fate of this doctrine is also not too well understood. The standard line, if you take a philosophy course, is that we can get rid of what Gilbert Ryle called the ghost of the machine. The ghost is the mind. We can get rid of that. No more mysticism. We just have the machine. And it's even commonly argued that Newton demonstrated that. The fact of the matter is Newton refuted it, much to his dismay and disbelief. He showed that the world is not a machine, that no mechanical system can have even the most elementary properties of the natural world, the motion of the heavenly bodies, of the tides, this thing falling to the floor if I drop it, and so on. Nothing is mechanical. There are no machines. So the ghost is intact, the machine is gone. And then comes the question, what do you do with that? And that has an interesting history. But going back to the core question of language, which was kind of dropped for centuries because there was nothing much to do with it. Now, you could pick it up in the mid-1950s and begin to try to work out what those principles would be, or what they would be. There's very good reason to believe that they're common to all humans. We know a lot more about that now than we did 70 years ago. But it's...
Was that an assumption of yours, or was that a conclusion that you came to, or a bit of both?
It was an assumption, but by now it's pretty well established. So if you take someone from a tribe in the Amazon that has had no contact with other humans for 20,000 years, let's say, and it's a child, bring it up in Boston, it'll be the same as everyone here, conversely. This hasn't been tried in every possible case, but it seems quite apparent. And there are other reasons to believe it, and it's the other reasons that convinced me, not the comparative reasons. The other reason, which is considered very controversial, but seems to me a truism, is that there's no other possible explanation of how anybody knows anything about language. We have virtually no evidence for what we know. So therefore it must be coming from something that's internal to us, and in that case it's shared because we're all the same. Genetic.
Say that again, because I want to make sure I get it, and I want to make sure other people get it.
So take the fact that we grow arms and legs, not wings, or that we undergo puberty at a certain age. Everyone knows that we didn't learn to do those things. It was not experience that got the embryo to develop through the years precisely in this way. And there's a simple reason. There's no relevant evidence in the environment. There's nothing in the environment of the embryo that says that grow arms, not wings. There's nothing in the environment of a 10-year-old kid that says you better have puberty. You know? These are just things that happen because that's the way we are. And if you take a look closely at cognitive development, it's very similar. You look really closely, you see that contrary to what sort of feels evident, you just don't have evidence for the most elementary things you know, from the meanings of words up till the interpretation of the expressions that we're using.
Well, I think one of the things which you might touch on is sign language, because somebody who is of a more empiricist mind might say, well, but of course people hear language all around them, and that's why they speak them. That's why they speak it, and that's why they're understood. But I don't know much about sign language, but I believe it became of interest to you because people spontaneously create languages, even if they don't have someone to teach it to.
Sign language is it's only in the last, really pretty much the last generation that we've gotten to understand a great deal about sign language. But I should say that the first person who picked this up was Eric Lenneberg, who was sort of founded the modern biology of language. But he was one of a small group of students at Harvard back around the early 50s. We were friends. There were 2 or 3 of us. Eric, Morris Halley, who some of you know, me, one or 2 others, who simply thought that the entire intellectual atmosphere was off the wall. At that time, the dogma was radical behaviorism, virtual dogma. Skinner's.
You should say a word about what that is, because
radical behaviorism means that everything is determined by conditioning and training and so on. So Skinner, Quine, the other leading figures were preached the doctrine, and it was standard. That was the behavioral sciences. In fact, the whole concept, behavioral sciences, is a very strange one. I mean, physics isn't called meter reading science. it's true that the data for physics comes from reading meters, but physics is not the study of data. It's the effort to explain the data. And any serious approach to human beings and their nature, to psychology, should be using whatever data you have, maybe behavior, maybe something else, to try to find out, to try to explain what's going on. So the very concept of behavioral sciences is just set things up completely in the wrong direction.
Do you know where the term came from, by the way? I mean, I don't, but it's an interesting question.
I think it probably came out of the funding agency.
That's what I would have guessed, the Ford Foundation.
Yeah.
Because they set up a center for behavioral science.
But it was just the spirit of the times. At late 40s, early 50s, very exuberant period that we're going to do everything you can imagine, partly for connected to U.S. political power, which was sudden. I mean, it's worth remembering that until the Second World War, the United States was a cultural backwater. It was like a small town in Indiana or something. If you wanted to study physics or mathematics, you went to Germany. You wanted to be a writer, an artist, you went to Paris. But nobody would stick around here. And in fact, a lot of the country is still like that. The changes have not, there have been changes since the 40s, but they left a lot of the country pretty much untouched, which is why you see many of the things you're seeing now. But the 40s changed everything. The Second World War changed everything. The U.S. came out just the world ruler, everyone else is destroyed, and that had its cultural counterpart. We can kind of throw out all this old, stupid European stuff, start afresh, do it the American way with technology and science, and computers were on the horizon. We had techniques of experimental techniques of conditioning, where information theory was coming along. We'll just start afresh, get rid of that old stuff, it's all nonsense, and do things the right way. And out of that, behavioral science came as a kind of a natural outgrowth of the whole intellectual cultural environment. But to get back to what I was saying about sign language, Eric, there were a few of us, I think maybe 3 or 4 at Harvard, who thought all of this was total nonsense. We were a tiny little group.
Lenenberg was German by birth, right?
He was German. Yeah. So Morris was Latvian originally, but they both knew German native. And that was a help because they could read the ethological literature, which at that time was pretty much unknown here. Tinberg and Lawrence and others, who were studying. There it was comparative zoology, but they were basically studying psychology from a different point of view, studying it the way you study the real way in which animals function, instinctive behavior, and so on and so forth. That was considered anathema. We didn't talk about it. But
because the way we studied animals here was by giving them rewards, punishments, and printing out schedules of reinforcement.
There was some skepticism about that. So if you take a look at undergraduate journals, one of the best was the Columbia Spectator, I think it was called, which was super behaviorist, the department. But the kids had a wonderful cartoon once where they showed a couple of pigeons, or maybe mice, in a cage, and one of them was saying to the other, "You see that guy out there? I have him conditioned. Every time I push a bar, he gives me a pellet." Which turns out not to be very far from true. But aside from little bits of skepticism here and there, it was dogma. It's still a very live issue. It shouldn't be, I don't think. Anyhow, Eric went on to become, to sort of do fundamental work. His book, Biological Foundations of Language, whatever it's called, 1966, 67, is the basis for modern biology of language. But one of the things he discovered back in the early 50s, which was not, it seemed so exotic that nobody paid attention to it at the time, but he was observing in the Perkins, the School for the Deaf. I forgot the name of it. It was a big school for the deaf here. And he went there just to observe. And at that time, and for a long time afterwards, the schools were run, and training was run by what was called the oralist tradition. Kids were not supposed to learn sign. That was wrong. They had to learn lip reading. So they were not allowed to sign. And the teachers were not allowed to sign, and parents were not allowed to gesture. This went on, and maybe it's still going on, but it went on for a long time. And what Eric noticed is that in the classroom, if the teacher turned to the blackboard, the kids will start doing like this. They had obviously invented their own sign language. And it was the kind of thing you didn't let the teacher see, you know. So you only did it when she was looking the other way. But that should have been picked up. But later, many years later, after much of this was understood, there were serious studies of this kind of thing. And there's a Lila Gleitman, a great psychologist, and one of her students, Susan Golden Meadow, actually found, this must have been, about 30 years ago, I guess, 20 years ago, found a group of several kids, 3 or 4-year-old kids who were cousins, who were deaf, and whose parents had been rigidly indoctrinated in oralism, so the parents wouldn't even move their hands, walk around like that. But when she observed the kids playing together, she noticed they were signing. And it turned out, when she looked at it closely, that they had invented their own sign language with no input, none, zero. And when it was investigated, very quickly, of course, they began to be taught American Sign Language. But what they had, the stage that they had reached was about normal for the developmental level. And since then, other such cases have been found. There have also cases of groups of people, deaf people, isolated from others who just invented their own sign language.
You're helping me connect dots, which I think will be particularly interesting to the MBE, mind-brain education people, because Eric Lenenberg was part of the Roger Brown, Ursula Bellucci group. Ursula Bellucci is one of the most eminent scientists who got a doctoral degree here at the Graduate School of Education, and is probably the leading researcher on the deaf.
Right.
You know, as Noam has implicated, and our mutual friend Jerry Fodor wrote it, most people thought that you couldn't learn anything about a language from the brain. That was the claim, and it was Lenenberg more than anybody else who, you know, saw language as a neural challenge. So I want to ask you, Noam, having my eye on the clock, when you hear the phrase cognitive science or cognitive psychology, what does that connote to you, and what kind of reactions do you have?
Well, cognitive science or cognitive psychology developed in the 1950s as kind of a reaction to the prevailing behavioral science kind of intellectual environment. It was George Miller, Jerry Bruner, a couple of others started doing experimental work which deviated from, in fact, conflicted with the doctrines, I would say, dogmas of the behavioral science mentality. And I think they must have founded the Center for Cognitive Science probably in the early 60s here at Harvard. George Miller himself had been a dedicated behaviorist. If you read his book, I think it's called Language and Communication, around 1950.
Textbook, basically. Yeah.
A textbook. It's very orthodox behaviorism, but he was a pretty open-minded guy, and more so than most. And he was actually Eric's supervisor and dissertation supervisor. It's kind of tricky in those days. If you were a psychology student at Harvard, there were 2 stars in the department, Skinner and Stevens, and they hated each other. They each thought that the other was was doing total nonsense. So if you were a student, you either had to be a Stevens student or a Skinner student.
Stevens was a psychophysicist, meaning he took physics as his model.
And George Miller was quite open-minded, so anybody who didn't want to fall into one of the other camps ended up with George, and Eric did. But cognitive science just began to develop as a kind of from taking kind of a critical attitude towards the behaviorist doctrines, and then pretty soon pursuing its own directions, and developed in all sorts of ways by now. But I mean, a lot of it is still associationist and behaviorist, but much of it isn't. But Miller and Bruner were set up the kind of institutional basis for a challenge for the system.
When you went to work at the Center for Cognitive Studies, do you remember what you were working on?
Yeah, it was 1964, so I was writing what became aspects of the theory of syntax.
The book that I mentioned that influenced John Rawls. There was a famous, or you might say infamous, debate between you and Piaget, even though you didn't like to call it a debate. Piaget's work is probably more familiar to people here. Can you say a bit about what you liked and what you didn't like in Piaget's work?
Yeah, the debate, incidentally, was invented by Harvard University Press in order to try to sell the book, literally. Everyone involved was strongly opposed to the title and the framework. But what it was a conference at Wyoming near Paris, where Piaget and I gave opening talks, and then others talked, and then it just went on. Piaget's work was extremely important in recognizing that children went through stages of conceptual development, and that these were not simply the results of training, but they were somehow coming from somewhere else. It's when you looked at the somewhere else that it became pretty mystical. I mean, there was no mechanism in Piaget for any of these stages to develop or for the transition to take place. It kind of became pretty hand-waving at that time. But he developed very interesting experimental techniques to try to show the kinds of things that children understood at various levels. And much of this, he opened experimental paradigms, which of course have been developed since, but have been extremely productive. A lot of his actual speculations about the nature of the stages don't entirely hang up. Turns out that when you do experiments much more carefully, that you can show that at much earlier stages than he assumed, children have implicit understanding of the kind that's often only exhibited at later stages. A lot of valuable work like this. And some of it on language, some on conceptual development. So that's all extremely valuable. At the conference that's in this book, it's kind of confrontational because there were Geneva psychologists, Piaget's colleagues, associates, Fodor and others, and there were a group of biologists, very fine biologists, François Jacob, Jacques Monod, others. Piaget, unfortunately, was a kind of a creationist. He had strange anti-evolutionary ideas, and this was kind of derided by the biologists who were there. There was a lot of the thrust of the debate was actually initiated by Jerry Fodor, who argued, I think plausibly and vigorously, as he tended to do, those of you know him, very vigorously, that all of this, that the approaches that the Geneva people were taking couldn't possibly make any sense, and that you had to assume fundamental innate characteristics even to get the most simple generalizations going. Rather along the lines of Nelson Goodman's a new riddle of induction, although Gutman himself didn't accept this conclusion. But
Yes, I do remember Jerry Fodor once said that if he could have written Fact, Fiction, and Forecast, which was the book where Gutman wrote about that, he would have been a very happy camper. But
except that Gutman never accepted the conclusion. What Gutman actually showed, though he never, I was a student when he was writing the book, and we argued about it at the time. But in fact, I've cited the book on this. But if you take a look at his argument, what he showed is that any inductive step depends essentially on the notations that you pick. So, famous green example, okay? But how do you pick one set of notations rather than another? Now there, he, being radically anti-natist, he assumed this just from experience, but there's absolutely no way for that to work.
well, that was really where you and he took.
Totally, but that was from the.
But I mean, going back to Piaget just for one more minute, it's also the case that Piaget didn't know what to do with language, and that was a big problem.
They didn't. The Geneva people didn't do much with language, but the others picked up their ideas, and they had a few proposals, which about the stages at which certain kinds of constructions could be developed. But work by Tom Bever and others using Piagetian techniques, but in a more sophisticated way, showed that this understanding was at a much earlier stage than they thought possible. They related it to certain levels of conceptual development, or tried to, but that didn't work out.
Well, I'd like to talk a bit about your own education, and then your more general thoughts about education before we open it up. You have often remarked that you were fortunate to have an education that you liked, since everybody here is interested in education, and many of us would like education to be like. Can you talk a bit about your pre-collegiate education?
Well, the pre-collegiate education was in two radically different formats. The first one, actually from about age 2 up to 12, was in a Deweyite experimental school run by Temple University Department of Education, which happened to be strongly Deweyite at the time. And it was a marvelous educational experience. It was challenging, no competition, everyone was, no ranking. In fact, I should say that after this I went into an academic high school, which is a black hole in my experience. But it was a shift from the two kinds of models of education that go way back to the Enlightenment. One model is the model of education as pouring water into a vessel, and then you take a test and so on. That's one model of education. Unfortunately, the one that's pretty much being imposed by current standards. The other model is that there was actually a nice image that was used by Wilhelm von Humboldt, the founder of the modern research university. He said that education should be like laying out a thread along which the student progresses in his or her own way. So there's a structure. It's not just anything goes, but what's important is learning how to learn, learning how to discover, how to invent, how to face problems, create new problems, solve them, and so on and so forth. That's the alternative model. And the Deweyite model is very much like that. So there were subjects, of course, but you were encouraged really to challenge, to inquire, to think them through for yourself, to do sometimes individual projects, a lot of joint work. But one interesting thing about it is that no one had a conception of how students were ranked. I didn't learn until I got to high school, literally. I didn't know I was a good student because the questions had never come up. I mean, I knew I had skipped a year, but nobody paid any attention. It just meant I was the smallest kid in the class. Nothing else happened. But and everyone was expected to do what they could do as well as possible. And for me, at least, it was a wonderful experience. For others, I think also. But the shift from that to a college-oriented academic high school, rigid curriculum, get the right answer to the test, then forget about what you learned, and so on. That was quite a dramatic shift. And then I went to college, and I was kind of fortunate to basically have...
This is all in Pennsylvania, the University of Pennsylvania.
Well, remember, in those days, you didn't leave home. So the idea of going to college somewhere where you didn't live didn't arise. You lived at home and worked and went to school. So I went to the University of Pennsylvania, but luckily for me, it was kind of totally unstructured. So it was possible in those days, more than now, to kind of just make up your own curriculum.
I'm just realizing, you were there then when the GI Bill had just been...
The GI Bill was just beginning, so a lot of the students in my class looked to me about like old men. I was 16, they were 25 or something. That's a big difference at that age. But I quickly ran into actually Nelson Gutman, Zella Harris, a couple of others in different fields, and just put together a kind of an odd collection of choices of discipline. So I had no professional training, really. None.
Well, let me ask a question. Ellen Lagerman, who was a dean here 10 or 15 years ago, had an interesting aphorism. She said, what people in education don't realize is that in the battle between Thorndyke and Dewey, Thorndyke won. Now, Thorndyke was essentially, within education, occupied the same role that Skinner would have had in psychology, somebody who was very much interested in the pouring the stuff down model rather than the opening up thread model. So if I were a Chomskyan, I might say, and I know you'll tell me I'm wrong, but I'm going to say, the natural inclination must be for people to think of education that way, and that's why the Dewey approach has been so difficult to instill and maintain all over the world. How would you respond to that?
Well, I think there are social and cultural pressures in that direction. So it's quite interesting, for example, to look at what happened right here in the transition from the 60s to the 70s. So if you haven't read it, I'd urge everyone to read quite a couple of important documents that came out in the early 70s from opposite ends of the political spectrum, which have a direct bearing on educational policy from that point on. One of them, from the right, is the Powell Memorandum, a memorandum by Justice Powell, who became a Supreme Court justice. He was a corporate lawyer. This was a memorandum which was intended to be confidential, but it quickly leaked. It was written to the Chamber of Commerce, a business organization. And it's a lament about the 60s. So it's the style is kind of interesting. It's paranoid and wildly exaggerated, kind of like a 3-year-old child who has a toy taken away and thinks the world is coming to an end. This is the mentality of the business world, recognizing they don't have 100% control anymore. It's only 98% control. So everything is a total disaster. So what he describes, and you really have to read it to get the sense, is how the colleges have been completely taken over by the Marxist left, run by Herbert Marcuse and others. The media are completely Marxist. The business world has been totally marginalized. They're oppressed minority. They have nothing left. Everything's been taken over by the radical left. The kids in the streets, taken over the universities, everything. And then he gives advice. He says, look, we don't have to just sit there and let this happen. We're the ones who fund the universities. We have the money. We can fight back and defend the important values of civilization against this crazed Marxist, feminist, etc. onslaught. And that begins from the right, what we have in fact seen in the schools, colleges, and universities since, imposing more discipline, more authority, more rigid approaches, and so on. Then go to the left, which is much more interesting as usual. The opposite end of the spectrum is a publication of liberal internationalists. In the United States, it's basically the Carter administration that goes out. There's similar groups in Europe and Japan. It's the first publication of the Trilateral Commission. It's called The Crisis of Democracy. And the American rapporteur was a professor at Harvard, Samuel Huntington, well-known liberal intellectual. And their position was...
Well, liberal compared to Powell, perhaps, but...
He's kind of a Kennedy, Roosevelt liberal.
All right, centrist.
Centrist, call him what you like. But this is basically Carter liberals. In fact, the members of the commission staffed the Carter administration almost entirely. That's basically where they come from. So what's the crisis of democracy? The crisis of democracy is exactly what Powell saw. Kids are running around in the streets. All these activist movements are starting. We're losing discipline. As Huntington put it, there's a failure of the institutions responsible for the indoctrination of the young. That's their phrase. This is on the liberal side. We have to do something about the institutions responsible for the indoctrination of the young. They're not doing it properly. So we have to have more rigidity, control, and in general, more moderation in democracy. The crisis of democracy is that people sometimes call the special interests are demanding rights, and there's too much pressure on the state to respond to all these demands. So we have to have more moderation in democracy. Then who are the special interests? Well, it turns out young people, old people, women and minorities, working people, farmers, and in fact the population. The population, instead of being passive, obedient, and quiet the way they're supposed to be, are demanding rights and pressing the state to respond to their needs and so on. Can't have this, so we have to have more moderation and democracy and do something about proper indoctrination of the young. So that's essentially the spectrum. And out of that comes what we call neoliberal capitalism, and with its impact on the universities. Now, that's not the first time this happened. The same thing happened after the First World War, which set the stage for also the educational system. If you read Walter Lippmann, for example, he was saying pretty much the same thing.
Yeah, it's funny. I didn't compute the Huntington, but if you said Schlesinger, I would have. But there was that was a different kind of splitting.
Well, I don't think there was that much of a split. So take Arthur Schlesinger, who is considered, he's known as the big issue at the time was the Indochina War. And Huntington and Schlesinger are supposed to have been on different sides. Were they? I mean, Schlesinger was a strong supporter of the Vietnam War up until 1966. During the period when he was involved, early 60s, he thought it was great. 1966, he began to be critical. He wrote a book called Atomic Bitter something or other, which was regarded as a critique of the war. But take a look at the critique. What he said is he was pitting himself against Joseph Alsop, right-wing, actually kind of a Huntington-style liberal, I should say, who was a strong supporter of the war. And Schlesinger says something like this. He says, "We all hope that Mr. Alsop will be correct, and that U.S. forces will be able to crush the opposition in Vietnam. And he's honest. He says, leaving it a land of ruin and wreck. We all hope we all pray, he said, that he will be correct, but he probably won't be. So therefore, we should think about taking a different approach. That's the criticism of the war.
Let me try to wrap this up because there's context here which probably not many people here know. Noam was already a very influential thinker in the academy, and his work in linguistics was beginning to be known by people interested in other social sciences. That's where the cognitive revolution, he was one of the revolutionaries. But a second Noam Chomsky emerged in the middle 60s as a critic both of the Vietnam War and more generally of American foreign policy, and not just American. I remember going to the first teach-ins when I was a student, where you and other people were, raising consciousness, so to speak, about rather analogous to what happened with Iran and other countries in subsequent years. And Noam has always taken the position that his science is a different enterprise than his work in political and economic criticism, and I have no reason to quarrel with that. But around the world is probably your political views, which are much more known by people who are educated, but not particularly in the academy. And I remember a few years ago hearing or reading that you do email for 5 or 6 hours a night. He's in touch with many people all over the world, often young, often very innocent and naive, but wanting to know things, and he tries to answer that. On the question I asked, I think I would agree if you were to say that there's always a pull within education and other social political realms between people who want to loosen up, give more freedom, more exploratory, and people who want to maintain the holds of power very, very tightly. Having reached a certain age myself, I'm rather depressed that Helen Logman seems to be more right than wrong. And when we talk about education here, we tend to talk about the nation at risk, and then the Educational Summit of the late 80s, which put together a bipartisan thing, which is right from George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton through the Obama administration. But now I'm getting political, so it's time, if it's okay with you, to open it up. So there's a mic on the floor, and I think it's first come, first answered. Sarah, are you going to be first?
Thank you very much for this interesting talk. I have two questions, one related to linguistics and one related to the topic of politics. As we were talking, I felt like what we were saying is that language is innate and that something compels us to communicate with others. But I'm wondering if that's more of a function of is language a function of coming into contact with
function of what?
Of coming into contact with others, or do people just communicate even if they're alone? I mean, what do anomalies teach us? Something like,
so what would happen to a child who was alone?
If they were alone, would they still have this innate compulsion to communicate?
Well, we don't do experiments with humans, so you can't really answer the question.
Yeah.
But the chances are that the child would be so utterly psychotic that the question wouldn't arise. Actually, there are some cases which are sort of like this. You know the case of Jeannie? Mm-hmm. That's the best known case. This is a girl who was, it's not her actual name, who was found when she was about 12 years old. She was locked in a room, tied to a chair. She had been there since she was about 2. Her lunatic parents had locked her in there and they shoved food in, and she'd apparently had almost no human contact since about 2 years old. When she was found, of course, she was released. The therapist who took care of her and tried to train her and get her back into the world is named Susan Curtis, a wonderful person, psychologist, who's written about it. And it looked as if, for a while, as if Jeannie she tried to see if she could take her into general cognitive development, including language. And it looked for a while as if she was gaining knowledge of language, but it turned out to be mostly an illusion. She was very smart, and she was able to, and apparently had a lot of charm, and was able to fool people into thinking that she was talking, but it turned out she couldn't recover language. Now, probably recover is the right word, because by now there's evidence that the children of age 2, if they've had normal exposure to language, they probably know most of the language already. They're not exhibiting it, but it seems to be in there. There's indirect evidence for that. So we don't know what happened in her case, but that's she has she was so psychotic that you can't tell what was happening from that experience. You can imagine. We know we know something about other kinds of cognitive development where you can experiment with animals. So, for example, the main work that was done is on the theory on vision, and it's known, you probably know these things, that if you take say a kitten at birth, and if the kitten is not given pattern stimulation, visual, if it's given no visual stimulation, its visual cortex just deteriorates. If it's given visual stimulation that isn't patterned, it'll never develop vision, and you get physical degeneration of the striate cortex, the peripheral parts of the visual system. And this means that if a kitten goes, say, several weeks without pattern stimulation, it will be physically blind. And that's the kind of thing that seems to be true of most aspects of development. If a child, let's say, is brought up, say, because of some physical disability, in stilts and can't walk, and maybe is cured at age 2, it will probably never learn how to walk. These are things just have to develop at their own pace. And probably language is like that, but we don't know for sure, because you can't experiment.
Thank you for that. My second question is related to dogma. We talked a lot about dogma in the 1950s and the 1960s and how that trajectory changed. What do you think are the dogmas of today that we might want?
Today?
Yeah.
You mean in the cognitive sciences, or?
Within education.
Education.
I guess within education, like in the 1950s, it was behaviorism that kind of politically also trumped the scene. I'm wondering if there are ways, and in a way that kind of is related to the political scene, because
related to, sorry?
The political scene.
The political scene. Like
the political scene and the theories of the 1950s. I guess that's my impression or my understanding, form the dogmas of that time that you can, I'm thinking aloud, that you can in a way indoctrinate people, or that people were vessels to be filled. And on the political side, you also had the sort of narrative prior that...
Well, I think it's not a simple situation by any means. In institutional politics, say party politics, there's been a shift to the right. So, for example, take, say, the Bernie Sanders phenomenon. Sanders was considered a radical, But if you take a look at his political positions, they wouldn't have surprised Eisenhower, literally. I mean, he was calling for higher taxes on the rich. During Eisenhower's period, they were way higher. His policies were basically New Deal policies. Eisenhower, his position, as he stated, was anyone who doesn't accept New Deal programs doesn't belong in our political system. By now, that's considered way out on the left, a political revolution and so on. Take a look at, say, Hillary Clinton. She's basically what used to be called a moderate Republican. Today's Republicans are just so far off the political spectrum, you can't even find them. But both parties have moved to the right. Today's what are called New Democrats, Clinton Democrats, are basically moderate Republicans. New Deal democratic programs are considered politically radical. That's what's happened at the institutional level. On the other hand, if you look at people, it's quite different. Very different. So just look around the room. If you had looked around the room 50 years ago, it would have been well-dressed white males. Okay? Period. But that's quite different. It's been a big change, and that it reflects itself in all kinds of ways. There's much more engagement in all sorts of issues and so on. You could see it in the spontaneous rise of the Sanders movement. Just push a button and it all comes out. So there's changes in different directions, which is part of the reason for the contemporary attention.
Great, thank you. We have a lot of questioners, so I'm going to ask people to give questions brief, and just one per customer. And if we get toward the end, what I may do is have people ask the questions one after another and let Professor Chomsky decide which ones to engage. But I think we're manageable for now.
Hi, Professor Chomsky. It's an honor to see you face to face. I've studied you for 4 years in undergrad, and so thank you for coming here and giving your talk. My question is about multilingualism, and what are your thoughts on multilingualism and the children who learn languages, more than 2-3 languages when they're born and after they're born, in their developmental years?
If children learn several languages.
What do you think of multilingualism?
As far as we know, children normally, without any special conditions, can easily learn 5 or 6 languages as they're growing up, and typically not even know their different languages. It's just you talk to the kids in the street this way, and you talk to your aunt this way, you talk to your grandmother this way, and so on. And there's a kind of a recognition that comes along maybe 3 or 4 years old, where look at this, I'm talking different languages. But it doesn't seem to have any inhibitory effect at all. That's just, again, you don't experiment with humans. These are just natural experiments, but that seems to be the way it works. And in many parts of the world, that's just normal. A kid growing up in West African communities may be normal. Or take my friend Morris Halley, who we mentioned. He grew up in Latvia, and he grew up with 5 languages. His parents spoke German, spoke Latvian to the kids in the street, picked up Russian somewhere, went to a Hebrew school, learned Hebrew. Yiddish was the background language, and they all just were there.
It's probably worth, and thank you, it's probably worth interleaving that we've been talking entirely, I believe, about spoken language.
Yeah. That's important. Actually, sign languages differ, and they do develop spontaneously. And we don't have experience about learning different sign languages simultaneously, but it would probably work the same way.
Dr. Chomsky, thank you very much. This has been a great talk so far. It's been really enlightening. And my question is this: the work of researchers like Mary Lou Jepson, Polina Hanikiva, Giorgio Ganis, and Jack Gallant seems to suggest that advances in artificial intelligence and nanomaterials may one day bring us to a point where brain-computer interfaces reach extremely high fidelity, essentially reading people's minds and uploading information directly into their brains. How do you see language evolving in a world where humans can share information while bypassing traditional sensory modalities?
I think one should be fairly skeptical about a lot of this, frankly. There's a lot of hype connected with artificial intelligence. I mean, there are certainly interesting things happening. There are useful developments. It's nice to have a Google Translator, these things that people carry around, let you do lots of things you couldn't do before. But I think the increments are not anywhere near as great as they claim to be. There's talk about what's called singularity. You know, we'll have computers so smart, which means programs, not the computer, programs so smart that they'll be able to do things that humans can't do. Well, that's true. It's already true of your hand calculator. It can multiply numbers way faster than you can and more accurately. It's also true that a bulldozer can move dirt faster than you can. But the intellectual content is much thinner. The achievements of AI are mostly through massive data collection and data analysis. So it's true that computers are good at storing data and going through it fast. And if you so take a look at how the translation works, for example. Back in the 1950s, it was thought that if we could understand language well enough to program computers to literally translate. Like I should say, I thought this was complete nonsense at the time. And it took a long time before it was realized that this is not the way to do machine translation. The way to do it, and the way your Google Translator works, is to take, say, the Canadian parliamentary records, which happen to be in French and English in parallel, and just take, millions of pages of this stuff and try to do a statistical analysis which says if this sequence of words appears in English, this sequence of words is likely to appear in French with some reasonable probability, and then you work all this out and get a Google Translator. Intellectually, it's worthless, but it's useful.
But is it true that initially your work was funded because the military didn't want to take what you were doing and use it for translation and
That's actually a widespread illusion. The way
I'm a widespread illusion.
No, it's very widely believed. But basically, the military didn't care what you were doing. So in our project at MIT, for example, some of the main work was on American Indian languages. The first generative grammar was actually at DATSA. We had people studying, translating Humboldt's great 19th century grammar. The military didn't care. What the military was doing was serving as a kind of a funnel by which taxpayer money was being used to create the high-tech economy of the future. So what was being done was just develop the high-tech economy. If you have
the ARPA kind, ARPA, for example.
Not just ARPA was actually a little bit later,
yeah.
But it came out of the early efforts to develop the internet in around 1960, which the military funded them, but nobody had any military purpose.
Well, we haven't found out whether there was a predecessor to Justice Powell who was writing about this.
No, this was just U.S. industrial policy. The way you developed the economy of the future was by the government, meaning the taxpayer, funding research and ultimately handing it over to private corporations for profit. You can see it very easily right around Cambridge. So take a walk around MIT and take a look at the buildings. And what do you see? You see pharmaceutical corporations, genetic engineering, and so on. And why are they there? Because they're ripping off the research that's done under public funding at the university. If you were here in the 1960s, you would have seen a private electronic firm ripping off the work that was being done at the Research Lab of Electronics at MIT and the Harvard Computer Lab. The cutting edge of the economy has shifted from electronics-based to biology-based. So therefore, funding has shifted, and the private enterprise system, so-called, follows along to try to cannibalize what's being done at public expense. I mean, the basic way the economy works is kind of public subsidy, private profit. And the Pentagon happened to be a natural way of funding electronics-based research and development.
You're reminding me of something. You talked about the end of the Second World War. There was an incredibly important document then, Vannevar Bush's paper, Science, the Endless Frontier, and you were essentially a fruit of that, and I was too, a little bit later. And that's so different now, where no candidate would want to talk about science that way.
Yeah, that was understood at the end of the Second World War that Vannevar Bush was the leader in this, that public funding of research and development would have an enormous effect on the growth of the economy.
Please.
Well, speaking of politics, I think a lot of us have last night's debate on the mind, and every 4 years it seems that we talk about the coarsening of public discourse, which is often hyperbolic, but I think maybe this year rings more true for a lot of us that maybe we've reached the nadir. And I'm wondering if you believe that the way that we communicate, that language, at least at the public level, has changed recently, what the root causes might be, and whether we can kind of ascribe qualitative judgments like better or worse to that. Just wondering what your thoughts were, especially if you saw the debate.
Well, I think the headlines this morning were pretty accurate. The level of the debate was kind of at a gutter level, which was kind of appalling, unless you look at history. So if you go back to the 1790s, it was about the same. Take a look at Jefferson's condemnations of John Adams. I mean, it's really pretty depressing to look at. Not very different from last night. In fact, Madison himself, by the early 1790s, in a letter to Jefferson, used a phrase which applies very well today. He deplored what he called the daring depravity of the time, describing both the corruption of the economic system by what he called stock jobbers, what we call financial institutions, and the vulgarity of the interchanges. So we haven't gone that far in 225 years. But it's true that in the short term, it's a dramatic decline.
Without putting words directly in your mouth, you've always been very suspicious of the notion that there can be something like a political science. I don't know whether you would apply it to economics too, but the getting laws of any sort about the way language changes in terms of the questioner, I think would be very difficult to.
Well, we just don't understand enough about humans and society. It's not a criticism of political science to say that it doesn't have deep theories. I mean, that wasn't true of the natural sciences either until a lot of understanding and insight had developed. For the most part, they were measurement sciences. In fact, as late as the late 19th century, the physics was still mostly a science of measurement. Changes took place later. So it's not a criticism of the field, it's just a comment on the complexity of the subject matter and the limits of our understanding. We just don't understand that much about human beings.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you so much for speaking with us today, Mr. Chomsky. My question comes about the topic of the critical period hypothesis. that children, the critical period hypothesis, that children develop language easier or more naturally before puberty. And many of us are language teachers, and we see that it can be a struggle to teach language in a classroom. So my question has to do with the arguments you've heard against the critical period hypothesis and how, as educators, we can maybe improve the input for our students, either younger than puberty or older students or adult learning languages. Thank you.
So again, it's the same problem that I mentioned earlier. We don't do experiments with humans. If you did, you could settle the question. So it's mostly experience. And there's some experimental work which seems to indicate, to conform with what general experience is, that there are several stages of linguistic development which are probably critical. I mean, first couple of years, most of the language is internalized. Around puberty, it appears to become harder to pick up a second language. You have to do much more work to do it. A child is just kind of like growing on. It happens to the child. The child doesn't do it. So it's probably basically correct, but it's not rigid. I mean, it is possible to gain a substantial command of a second language in your, say, in your 20s or 30s, if you have the proper commitment to it. Now, that's why when you say go to Europe, by now, not 50 years ago, but now practically everybody speaks English, and they all learn it as a second language and somewhat later.
Thank you. Yeah, we'll keep going just to these questioners, I think, but no one additional. Yeah.
All right. Good. Okay. Hi. Thank you very much for today's talk. I've always enjoyed reading your political commentary as well. So my question really is, what are your views on the strain of anti-intellectualism that we do see today in political discourse? And also to comment a little bit about the ability or inability of language to communicate truth in an age of truthiness, where, especially in the age of new media, where if lies told often enough, hold a very strong quality of truth in them.
He's interested in the latter part of his question about the fact that about the situation where people assert things without any evidence, and if it's repeated often enough, this is Stephen Colbert's term of truthiness. It acquires the veneer of truth, and he put it in the broader spectrum of anti-intellectualism. It's a question about today, but I suspect you may tie it to other times.
Never changed.
Yeah.
I mean, this is always true, as far back as you go. Dogmas are accepted no matter what the facts. And it's nothing about language, it's just part of the general cultural level. It's pretty surprising in the United States. I mentioned before that one of the things that people often don't understand about the United States is, again, that up until the Second World War, it was a kind of cultural backwater, and it remains that for a large part of the population. So, say, one of the problems about convincing people that there's a problem with global warming is that about 40% of the population in the United States, not elsewhere, but 40% in the United States are convinced that it's not a problem because the second coming is pretty near, maybe a couple of decades. Do they have evidence for that? I mean, these are just deep-seated beliefs, long history. It's always been an extremely fundamentalist religious country, and a lot of it remains like that. But what you're seeing is nothing new. It's just, it's
maybe the question leaning toward, do you see signs of hope, or do you think this is a condition?
Sure, there's signs of hope. A lot of the population's changed. I mentioned before what this room would look like 50 years ago. that's a sign of hope, and it's indicative of many other things.
Okay, thank you. Let's keep going. 3 or 4 more questions.
Thank you for your time today. My question is about, earlier in your talk today, you were mentioning about languages you're describing as a form of technology in terms of people. So my thought is, kind of what sort of things in terms of activism or language, what sort of things in terms of activism and language, for instance, when you were speaking about technology or language as a technology, what sort of things in this current bleeding edge of that technology, what might we have to look forward to in a humanistic sense?
How would technology affect language?
When you say, I think when Noam was talking about language as a technology, I think you were using it.
Language itself as a form of technology.
Yes, language itself is a form of technology. When you were describing that,
what's going on in your head when you're producing these expressions is that you're unconsciously and inaccessible to consciousness. Your mind is working through something kind of like a computer program, which is putting together a complex expression that articulates a thought that you have. How you're choosing to do that, nobody has a clue. But in fact, nobody has a clue how you choose to lift your finger. It's even simpler thing. That's a total mystery. But we can begin to understand some of the things that are going on in your mind, and even begin to fairly to find some of the neural correlates to them. So in that sense, there's a kind of a mechanical procedure, formal procedure, like a computer program to multiply. But the crucial thing about it is that it does have this creative character that Descartes recognized. It is the case, and that the early Galileo and others recognized. Somehow, this internal system of computation that you and I share, and probably all humans share, we are able to use it to convey to others the thoughts that are in our minds, and of course those others have no access to our minds. So how does this miracle take place? That's what amazed Galileo and his associates and his colleagues, and it's correct. Still a great mystery.
Is that clarifying what you were asking about?
Yeah, it does, in a way. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Hi. So my question comes from being a multilingual, bilingual and a multicultural person, and from my experiences, it has really brought a lot of confusion in being a bilingual or almost a trilingual. And my question is there a state of cognition preceding language that all cultures and languages want to reach in?
You said, is there a state of cognition prior to
prior to language?
Prior to language that all cultures and language would just
cultures and language
want to reach, want to evolve into.
It's kind of hard to. I mean, I would assume so, but it's pretty hard to study because it's kind of like asking, is there thought without language? Do dogs think? How do we answer the question? The only way we know how to study thinking is through its linguistic articulation. And we can see that we certainly do lots of things that we can't articulate in language. Like if I decide how I'm going to drive to work tomorrow, we're trying to figure out which path to take where I won't run into a detour and all that kind of stuff. You're doing complex computation of some sort, but you can't describe it. And presumably that's happening with other organisms. But it's extremely hard to study. So
Yeah, I mean, Professor Chomsky's gift to other areas of cognition other than language is really to what extent can the ways in which he analyzed syntax and grammar be applied to other spheres.
Well, that's Jack Rawls is interesting in this respect. Yeah. One of the things that, if you look at Rawls's theory of justice, it uses a grammatical model. What he was thinking about was asking, can you construct something like a generative grammar for moral judgment? Now, the history of this idea is kind of interesting. He came under really harsh criticism for this, so much so that he kind of put it to the side and worked on other things. But it was picked up the last 10 years or so, first by John Michael, a young philosopher, teaches law at Georgetown, who did a very good dissertation, finally a book, first answering Rawls's critics, picking up Rawls's model, responding to Rawls's critics, and then beginning to develop something like a moral grammar, and even initiating empirical research to see if you could verify its conclusions. Now, that work was since picked up by others, Mark Hauser, a couple of others, and it's a live field. You could do it in other areas.
Okay. Thank you. You have 2 more questions, okay?
Yeah.
Professor Chomsky, this is a question from my father, a PhD in linguistics from 1984 at Georgetown, and he's asking me this from Morocco, and I think I owe this to him. He's asking how, in the future, you think universities will continue to teach linguistics apart from a general education subject and apart from the current engineering approaches to linguistics in schools of science and engineering.
How will linguistics be taught as a subject on its own in education, in higher education, particularly, for example, engineering, or will it be simply absorbed? Is that the?
Apart from the way that it is already being studied for engineering, is it going to be taught as a field of its own, on its own?
But you mean more humanistically?
I'm sorry?
You mean more humanistically? Or?
The way it used to be taught before the 80s.
Early 80s. Well, by now it's expanded way beyond that. But there is a serious question, and it's not just about linguistics. It's about what's going to happen to university education. There are major efforts to try to impose a business model on the educational system and to get it to produce objects called graduates who will be useful for the business world. Now, this has taken its most extreme form in the United States, probably in Wisconsin, where the government, the state government, is really destroying one of the finest universities in the country, University of Wisconsin, by trying to reshape it so that its sole goal is to produce graduates useful for the current business world in Wisconsin. I mean, apart from the sort of vulgarity of the program, it's also going to destroy the business world, because it's not going to function unless real education takes place. I mean, it even got to the point where it led to a media backlash. At one point, the governor, Scott Walker, his whatever committee had, decided that they should remove from the official formulation of the university's purpose, pursuit of truth. Because who needs that stuff? And that was a little too much, so they had to claim it was a clerical error and restore it. But this is happening not just there; it's happening in Europe too. The Tory government, conservative government in Europe, in England, has imposed programs of marketization, which essentially say that, for example, if the classics department at Oxford wants to receive money, they can show that they can survive in the market. Okay, that they have a product that can be commercially viable. One commentator, Stefan Collini, that guy who writes about educational policy, I think wrote maybe Times Literary Supplement or somewhere that the government is trying to convert first-class universities into third-class commercial enterprises. And this kind of thing is happening all over much of the world in various ways. And unless that's resisted, universities are going to lose their highest values and achievements, which were not perfect by any means, but are worth preserving. It's a real struggle. It's kind of an analog to turning the elementary schools into places where you produce kids who can answer questions on the exam and not understand how to learn or discover.
Well, you can tell your father that some of us are working on this issue. Last question, thank you. Yeah.
Right, it's going to be the last consumer-centric question, and I also hope this question is to be fruitful. And I believe, as myself, who's really interested in educational linguistics, many people sitting here should be, and there's a lot of people who believe there's a certain age that beyond which we are going to have a hard time, where it is almost impossible to reach perfectly acquiring the language. But many people would believe, like, if given some good or benign environments, it is still possible to acquire the language almost perfectly in later or adult age. What do you believe should be some benign environments or factors that's going to impact positively to our language acquisition, regardless of the age or the adult or later age of our life?
I think the gist of your question was, can we abolish puberty so that people can continue to learn languages easily into later life? Is that your question?
Kind of like asking if we can grow wings and fly like eagles.
Is that your question?
I wouldn't say abolish the puberty, but
we are physical organisms stuck with what we are, and with tremendous capacities, but your very capacities impose limits. If you have the capacity to grow arms, it's because you're genetically designed to grow arms. But that means you're blocked from growing wings. And this carries over to the cognitive domains as well. If we're capable of acquiring certain things and gaining certain kinds of understanding, it's going to follow that there are other things we'll never understand. This is a very controversial view. It's commonly believed, many scientists believe, that we can really learn anything. But I think that's basically assuming that we're not organisms, we're angels. If we're part of the organic world, that we're going to have structure which yields capacities, and by their very nature yield limitations. And I think there are, it's a long story, can't go into it here, but there are interesting cases in history where we have reached the limits of understanding. In fact, what I mentioned about the mechanical theory of the world is one of them. The early scientific revolution was based on the conception that the world is a machine. Newton, to his dismay, proved that it isn't. He never believed it and regarded it as an absurdity that no scientific person with scientific capacity could ever believe, but it seems to be true. This is mainly because of interaction at a distance, which is not mechanical. And what happened actually is a very important change in intellectual history, which is, I think, not sufficiently acknowledged. What happened is that the goals of scientific inquiry were lowered. For Galileo, Newton, and others, the goals were to get an intelligible account of the world. The goals were lowered to gaining intelligible theories about the world. So everybody, scientists could understand Newton's theories. He could, of course, understand his theories, didn't think they were absurd, but he thought what they were saying was absurd because they were not giving a picture of the world that's intelligible to us. And if you look at the later history of science, it just gets more and more unintelligible. But I think I think things like that happen in the literature and the arts and elsewhere. You do hit limits, and then you have to search other ways.
Thank you.
Let me make one final comment, unless you have a final comment you want to make. Noam Chomsky, as he pointed out, grew up in an America where it was possible to get a broad education, and there's nobody who made better use of it than you did. Even just hearing for an hour, we ran through history, science, language, politics. As Phrase was talking about art, literature. I feel lucky that I, being half a generation younger, had that privilege as well. It is in jeopardy for the reasons that he mentioned, and neither of us is going to be around that much longer. It's really up to you all. The phrase I use, which some of you have heard, it's Howard Gardner's attempt to be witty, it is between the literacies and the livelihoods. Literacies begins with LI, it's what you learn in school so you can do anything scholastic. Livelihoods, ultimately, you want to have them, you want to work, you should be able to work. But another thing that begins with LI is liberal arts and sciences. And fundamentally, that's what our universities and colleges, more than anywhere else in the world, gave people a chance to do without becoming pre-vocational or hyper-vocational. But for the reasons that Noam said, it's very much in jeopardy. You've gotten a whiff of it today from one of the intellectual giants, and the way we can thank him, beyond a round of applause, is to make sure that people in the future have access to that breadth and that wisdom. Thank you.